very much, and thank you everybody for coming, and thank you for staying. And hopefully we'll get you home by the third period for the Canucks fans in the room. I'd like to actually pick up on a lot of the themes that Jody talked about. In fact, thankfully, we don't contradict each other. A lot of the themes that Jody talked about had to do with the nature of adolescent crime in Canada and what psychologists can do about that. And I'll be talking about violence more particularly, as opposed to crime more generally, and also focusing on adults. So we're going to transition to an older age group, but I'll also be talking about what psychologists can do and what psychologists have done in order to facilitate the understanding of violence and at a more practical level, preventing violence and assessing risk for violence and so forth. So just to give you a bit of a summary, I'd first like to kind of paint a picture, give you the landscape, the nature of violence in Canada, how much violence is actually committed, what types of violent behaviors, against whom, and so forth. I'm going to talk a little bit about theories of violence, and these are really important to actually help guide research in psychology. If you consider psychology to be a social science, science is nothing if it doesn't have a theoretical basis to help us understand the phenomena that we're trying to research, as well as to help explain what we observe. But then I'll move into more pragmatic matters about how we can go from the theoretical to the practical in terms of understanding violence and predicting and preventing violence and so forth. And I'll conclude with a few comments about how psychology might be able to inform the reduction for the risk of violence and actually reducing violent recidivism. So how much violence happens in Canada? And if we define violence as murder, attempted murder, assault, robbery, and sexual offenses, how much violence actually happens in Canada? So here's a bit of an academic Jeopardy scenario for you. Here's an answer, 17. What's the question? I'll be really surprised if anybody gets this.
Violent acts per day.
Violent acts per day. Good guess. Number of violent offenses reported to the police during this talk. So in the next 30 minutes, there'll be 17 violent offenses, as covered down here at the bottom, reported to the police. Here's another answer, 304,000. Beg your pardon? Per day? Ooh, I hope not. Per year, yes. Number of violent offenses reported to the police in 1 year in Canada. That's a whole lot of violence. We know actually it's extraordinarily costly to those who experience it in terms of health effects, to the economic burden on our health system, because many of these 304,000 people will end up in hospitals trying to recover. The government of Canada spends, and of the provinces, about $3 billion a year just on the correctional systems. And that doesn't account for the costs devoted to police, to judges, the judiciary, and so forth. I'd like to point out something called the dark figure of crime. This is something that criminologists have talked about for quite some time. And it gets at the idea that reported crimes are a vast underestimate of the actual number of crimes that happen, because most crimes are not reported to the police. Reported crime underestimates true crime rate, and by some estimates, the actual crime rate is about 5 to 10 times higher than the reported crime rate. To give you an example of this, Statistics Canada conducts what they call the General Social Survey every 5 years or so. And they ask questions about violence in this survey, and then they make extrapolations to the prevalence of violence in Canadian society. So they actually estimate that there are not 304,000 acts of violence in a year, but there's 2 million violent crimes in a year in Canada. 2 million. Involving 1.2 million victims of violence aged 15 or older. And what that means is that some people are obviously victimized more than once. But note that this excludes people under the age of 15. So by definition, it also excludes child abuse. And they remove from their definition here spousal violence. And we know that about 7 to 8% of long-term relationships include physical violence going in one direction or both directions between partners. So that would be about 115 violent crimes that happened during this talk. Better hurry up. Yeah. or 345 between the three of us. Just to give you a sense of the important public health concern that violence is. Most of these violent crimes are assaults, and they are what can be called level 1 assaults, which is common assault, punching somebody, beating somebody up. Level 2 assaults and level 3 assaults down here, 17% of all crimes, of all violent crimes. This is aggravated assault and assault with a weapon. Next we have robbery, sexual assault, other assaults, assaulting a police officer and so forth, other sexual offenses and so forth. Just to give you a bit of a sense of the types of violent offenses that happen. Jody talked about the crime rates over time. So this is the memory test portion of the talk. Are the crime rates A, decreasing, B, increasing, C, increasing and then decreasing? C, great, good answer. So we see violent crimes down here at the bottom. All crimes tend to kind of peak in the early 90s or so and then start to level off. How about the homicide rate, the murder rate over time? Do you think it follows a similar pattern, or do you think it's going up or going down?
That's your number. Depending on what's going on with the economy and mental health issues, all the things.
Okay, sure, it can certainly respond to what's going on in the economy and inflation and employment rates and so forth. It follows a pretty similar pattern to other crimes. So it has been more or less decreasing since the early 90s, with a bit of an increase over the last couple of years, but that could be, just as Jody had mentioned, kind of little fluctuations over time. Crime rates by province. What's the most violent or crime-infested province? Here in BC, it's La La Land, right? Everybody wants to live in Lotus Land. We hang around in January at Starbucks, sitting outside. It's a beautiful place to live. Anybody have a guess? Speak up. Montreal.
Toronto takes first, Vancouver takes second.
The 3 blocks of Hastings. That's an excellent answer, yes. Avoid those 3 blocks of Hastings. We see actually very strong relationship between East and West, with the West being having much higher crime rates than the East.
Really?
And this is a phenomenon you see in the US as well. Ontario, in fact, has the lowest crime rate. How about the murder rate by province? Similar? It's similar. BC is a little bit lower, but we see it higher in the West than in the East. And if you really want to be safe, move to Prince Edward Island.
How does that correspond?
And we can talk at the end about some potential explanations for this geographic variability, but I thought just to give you a bit of a sense of how crime is distributed in our country. What age group do you think is most likely to perpetrate violence? Younger, older, what age range? Would you say, Dan?
85.
85 plus, good guess. Are you sure you're the
Senior citizen.
You're sure you're the chair of our department? Yes? 25 to 35, okay. It's actually, crime and violence peak at about age 15. This is general property crime, the bars, and the line is violent crime, and then a steady decline. Any 15 or 16-year-olds here? Oh, miss at the back, okay. Look out. How about in terms of victims of violence? More likely to be male or female? Male. For all types of violence except for sexual violence. How old? Same age group, 15 to 24. So it's actually mostly young males beating up young males. That's primarily the majority of violence in Canada. Single or married? Single. As one of my colleagues likes to say, finally a reason for marriage. Urban or rural? Urban, yes. And known or unknown to perpetrators? Good. About 50 to 80% of incidents are committed by friends, acquaintances, and family. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about a couple of theories of violence. Obviously, I hope I've demonstrated that violence is very common in our society. It happens to a lot of people. It happens mainly among the younger folks in our society, but also to adults as well, obviously. So I'm going to just very briefly tell you about a couple of theories, and over on the right-hand side, the indicator risk factors, some of the more concrete examples that we could expect to come out of these theories. So there's been biological theories of violence. For example, people have talked about the imbalance of neurotransmitters or chemicals in our brain that help us, well, do everything, basically. People have talked about genetics, so there is no gene for crime, there is no gene for violence, but there are certainly predispositions to certain types of personality or behavioral styles that may then put people at higher risk for acting in an aggressive manner. So some of the indicator risk factors would be certain mental illnesses, which we know have neurochemical or genetic components, emotional dysregulation, and parental characteristics. So in fact, if we know that in previous generations, parents engaged in criminal behavior, we know that that is a risk factor for criminal behavior in the next generation. Social learning theory would suggest that a lot of crime and violence is due to reinforcement principles. That is, people are rewarded or reinforced for acting in an antisocial way. That is, they act in an antisocial way and they get something they want, and that is reinforcing. They can also be reinforced by modeling parents, for instance, modeling peers. Vicarious reinforcement means that if somebody observes another person getting reinforced for acting in an antisocial manner, they might just try it themselves. So some of the risk factors we would look for here include an antisocial peer network, which is one of the things that Jody talked about, parental criminality again, and parental discipline style, overly harsh or abusive parental discipline style. Social bonding or control theories have to do with the extent to which people are bonded to and believe in society and its norms and values, and also the degree to which people are attached to others and attached to conventional societal institutions, the idea of marriage, for instance, and therefore would be concerned by the reactions of other people to their behavior. So we can look here at things like antisocial attitudes, unemployment, being unmarried, and so forth. Just a couple more. Social disorganization theory looks at the idea of disruption in social integration, so a lack of consensus about the norms or values in a community, and also people in those communities who have a discrepancy between what you could call the ideal, if you can assume that most people want to have stability, financial stability, a good place to live, somewhere to sleep, and so forth, and the actual. To the extent that people don't have these things, it puts a strain on them, and then they may take whatever means possible, even if they're not pro-social means, to try to obtain the ideal, to obtain material wealth and so forth. So we can look at neighborhood factors as a risk factor, living situation stability, housing conditions, and so forth. And finally, there's a host of what you could call psychological theories that would essentially hold that different personal characteristics, individual differences between us, some of those may be more likely to lead to violent behavior. And these can interact easily with preceding theories, so certain types of personalities may do better in a disorganized neighborhood, a chaotic neighborhood, somebody who's stable and low-key, for instance. Some of the important constructs that people have looked at include psychopathic personality, hostility, anger, and mental illness. So let's go from theory to practice. Here's people's ideas about what is important in terms of violent behavior. Let's look at first where society intervenes in violent incidents. So when these 304,000 violent acts occur, what happens? First, when we're dealing with young kids, kids under 12, most of what happens in response to aggressive behavior comes from parents, schools, and possibly from provincial ministries. If we move to adolescence, this is the topic of Jody's presentation, the youth criminal justice system may intervene. And finally, when we move to adults, primarily we're dealing with courts and correctional systems, obviously prisons and jails. Sentencing decisions, as Jody was describing, often have to do with forecasting whether a person will be violent or not in the future. And whether or not people get out of prison, well, when people get out of prison, because in Canada, almost every person gets out. There are very, very few people who will stay in prison forever. Parole decisions are made primarily on whether or not a person poses an undue risk of harm to society upon release. And that calls for a risk assessment. In the forensic psychiatric system, it's a similar kind of process. These are people who have been found not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder, so they've engaged in some criminal behavior, but they didn't have an appreciation of what they were doing due to suffering from a mental disorder. So they're found not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder and are in the forensic psychiatric system. If they pose an undue risk of harm to society, they'll be detained in a forensic hospital. If they don't, they'll be released conditionally into the community. So again, that's a risk assessment that has to inform that decision. And finally, the civil psychiatric system, the state has the power to actually hospitalize people against their will if they have a mental disorder and they're in need of treatment and they either pose a risk of harm to themselves or to other people. So it's the risk to other people element of the civil psychiatric system that calls for, again, a violence risk assessment. So what is the role of psychology here? What can we do to help make decisions? There are thousands of decisions in these different systems that are made on a daily sort of basis. And a lot of what psychology does is based on the theories that I talked about and based on research that we conduct, we try to help to identify what the most useful risk factors are to help inform these decisions, how we can develop methods and measures to evaluate them. Jody was talking about risk assessment tools, how we can evaluate these risk assessment tools and these different methods, and then finally, how we can put this into practice in terms of assisting decision makers. I'd like to talk about one risk factor, this psychopathic personality. As psychologists and psychologists at SFU, we study a lot of different risk factors, but psychopathy we study quite a bit, and there's a good reason, as I hope to demonstrate to you. Let me first tell you what psychopathic personality is. People will be familiar with the idea of personality, right? How many people here have a personality? Okay. How many people don't have a personality? Okay, nobody will admit it. Richard, yeah. So we use terms like trustworthy, friendly, reliable, outgoing, gregarious, and so forth. We use these terms to describe people's basic ways of relating to others. When there are a lot of personality traits that are potentially harmful or dysfunctional or cause distress to a person or to others, when a lot of these come together, we call it a personality disorder. And psychopathic personality can be construed as a personality disorder. This is sometimes also called antisocial personality disorder. And it is comprised of a number of different characteristics. So interpersonally, that is the way that people get along with others, people who are highly psychopathic don't play well with others. They tend to be very superficial. They may try to be or appear to be charming, but you can tell it's a bit disingenuous. They have a grandiose sense of self-worth. They think that they are better than others, essentially. They may pathologically lie. They may lie just for fun, which some people have called duping delight. That is, they take some pleasure in fooling other people. And they may also be very manipulative, both from grand schemes to really small scale schemes and scams. Emotionally, people who are highly psychopathic tend to have very shallow emotions. They don't experience much emotion. They lack remorse or guilt for the bad things that they do. I mean, often, many of us feel bad for things that we haven't even done, things that aren't our fault. These folks may hurt other people and not care. They may be callous and lack empathy, meaning that they don't understand or appreciate other people's situation, and they don't take responsibility for their own behaviors. Not surprisingly, these people tend to have had poor behavioral controls, bad temper, and to have had this since they were young, and to have been involved in a host of different types of juvenile and adult crime and aggression. And in terms of their lifestyle, finally, we see that people who are highly psychopathic tend to have a need for stimulation and a proneness to boredom, a parasitic lifestyle, meaning that they would prefer other people to pay their bills. Wouldn't we all, but most of us do pay our own bills. They lack goals. They may bounce around from job to job, quit their jobs, move around on short-term notice and so forth. They tend to be impulsive, make decisions kind of without giving it much forethought, and engage in irresponsible behavior like drinking and driving and so forth. So this is kind of a recipe for criminal behavior. People who have these personality characteristics tend to engage in crime quite often. So let me give you an example of what we do with this personality construct. The Psychopathy Checklist is an instrument developed at that other university in town, I keep forgetting its name, by Robert Hare, who's a professor emeritus there now. It has 20 features or symptoms of psychopathy that he's proposed and refined over time. Includes standard definitions of these symptoms. It's rated by professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, and so forth. Also by trained graduate students. So we send our grad students into prisons and into forensic hospitals to complete this and similar measures. There's strict scoring and rating instructions to try to facilitate reliability of use. It includes over a 2-hour interview with, for instance, a criminal offender in a prison. This is a standardized interview, again, to try to facilitate reliability and consistency. We review people's available file information on their progress, for instance, in a prison, how they've been behaving and so forth. And a score finally is given. And the higher the score, the more psychopathic. The question is, for us, does it predict violence? So again, let me just tell you about a research study conducted by Robert Hare, 728 male offenders in British prisons. I'll tell you about a Canadian one shortly. They looked at recidivism, and they found an odds ratio of 22 for violence, meaning that those who were highly psychopathic, the odds of violence after release from prison were 22 times greater than those who were not very psychopathic. If you look here at these different bars, for general recidivism, that is any type of recidivism, this is the group who's not very psychopathic, this is the group who is psychopathic. 80% versus 40%. If we looked at violent recidivism, 3% versus 38%. Violent recidivism. This is a really meaningful difference. These are the sorts of things that may inform parole boards or review boards in forensic hospitals about whether people are safe to be released at the current time. We conducted a similar study here in Vancouver, looking at people who had been discharged from a psychiatric hospital, from Riverview Hospital, actually. And we followed them up for a couple of years. We looked at rehospitalization and so forth. And we looked at, again, the odds of community violence after discharge as a function of low versus high scores on this psychopathy instrument. And we found that high scores were related to 5 times the odds of physical violence and to 13 times the odds of being arrested for some criminal offense that was violent in nature. Again, this is a meaningful relationship that we can make a statement about an individual's risk for violence based on this psychological research. Other notable findings about psychopathy, it's related to not only the occurrence of violence, but how often people are violent, the frequency, the imminence, so how quickly after release from an institution will a person be violent, again, is related to how psychopathic they are. The nature of violence, we tend to see more instrumental violence, that is violence used to obtain some end goal, robbery, for instance, as opposed to emotionally based, reactionary types of violence, which we see in other sorts of folks. And to severity, so how much harm to the victim. People who are more psychopathic tend to hurt people to a greater degree. But psychopathy is just one risk factor. There's a host of other risk factors out there that people have been studying. In the last 10 years, there's been over 3,000 empirical scientific studies on violent behavior. It's one of the most commonly studied topics. When we compile these different risk factors, these other risk factors. We're drawing from theory, we're drawing from this vast body of scientific literature, and the field of violence risk assessment does this. And what psychology does is try to develop standardized assessment instruments, as Jody was also describing, that incorporate these scientifically supported risk factors that also stem from theory, estimate the risk for future violence, and importantly for us, also point to promising risk reduction opportunities. It's all fine and good to be able to predict or evaluate or estimate the risk for future violence, but if you're not going to do anything about it, why bother? So now we know who's going to be violent, who cares? What are we going to do about it? And that's actually to the credit of a lot of agencies in Canada. They actually do try to do something about it. The Correctional Service of Canada is a leader in the world in terms of implementing violence reduction treatment programs. And many other countries have modeled their correctional system and their correctional treatment after Canada's correctional system. I'll tell you just about one of the instruments that we have been working on at SFU for a number of years, called the HR20 Violence Risk Assessment Scheme. So I'll tell you what H, C, and R stand for also. H stands for historical. So these are risk factors defined primarily by the fact that they happened in the past or they have something to do with experiences that people went through at some point in their life. There's 10 of these, just a couple of examples. They include previous violence, substance use problems, major mental illness, and psychopathy. C stands for clinical. This is how people are doing currently, or in the very recent past. Over the last couple of months, how have people been functioning in terms of mental functioning, emotional functioning, and behavioral functioning? A couple of examples here. There's 5 of these on the actual instrument: pro-criminal attitudes, psychotic symptoms, and impulsivity. A psychotic symptom is a feature of a mental illness that involves disturbance to thought or affect. So for instance, if a person has heard, have you heard of hallucinations? These are people who experience sensations that don't have any real reference in reality. So hearing voices that don't exist, or feeling that you have something crawling on your skin when you don't. Others include delusions. These are irrational beliefs, again, that have no basis in reality, believing that everybody here in this room is actually an alien. Some people have delusions, false beliefs along these lines. The R stands for risk management. And again, there's 5 of these risk factors on the instrument, but just as a couple of examples, we have poor treatment plans, stress, and lack of social support. And these are estimates about how people will be functioning in the future. So this instrument captures past, present, and future. It draws 20 risk factors based on theory and research. Unlike some of the youth instruments, this actually has been researched a lot. So this is the nature of samples. It's been used in these different countries with offenders, forensic psychiatric patients, civil psychiatric patients, and with a couple of youth samples in 47 different studies. And this actually always reminds me of the medal standings at the Winter Olympics. And for those of you who are interested, this is the actual medal standings at the Salt Lake City Winter Olympics. And you see Canada's up there at the top. Sadly, not in the actual Olympics. There's actually a strong relationship between these two things, which tells you one thing, that correlation sometimes is meaningless. There's an update to this. There's now been 16 translations into different languages and 66 different research samples comprising about 8,000 different participants. So there's been a fair amount of research on this particular risk assessment instrument. So, does it work? We looked at this question in 188 criminal offenders released from BC prisons, some of them just down the road, and tracked for about 6 years. We divided the HR20 up into different score levels, and you can see those who scored low had 10% recidivism, violent recidivism. The next highest scoring group had 30%, 29%. The next highest scoring group had 69% recidivism, and the next highest scoring group had 93% recidivism. So basically, the more risk factors that a person has, the greater the risk for violence. We just need a good, reliable, systematic way to capture those risk factors, which is what these instruments try to do. And let me just skip to this idea of violence risk reduction and end my presentation there. We can identify risk for violence relatively well, but how do we reduce it? Violence has been with people since the beginning of time. It exists across all cultures. One might say it's, despite being a very complex, not completely well understood behavior, it's a very basic, fundamental human behavior. It's always been with us. Will incarceration or punishment alone work? Well, I think Jody made the point that with kids, not likely. And the same thing is true with adults. In fact, incarceration alone may slightly increase recidivism. Now, I wouldn't advocate that we remove all prisons, but what I'm saying is that if we do incarcerate people, if we don't do anything else, if we don't provide some kind of intervention or treatment opportunities, it will not decrease recidivism. In fact, it may actually slightly increase it. There's been a lot of work done by psychologists working in the correctional systems and so forth in Canada on what could be called psychologically informed violence reduction. And these are risk management treatment programs that focus on risk factors. So if we know, based on some of the research that I showed you, that substance abuse is important, that pro-criminal attitudes are important to know about, that certain types of mental illnesses or certain types of personality dispositions are important risk factors, then why don't we design treatments that actually address these to try to reduce the level of the risk factors? It's a simple principle. It's not that easy to do in practice, but it's a simple principle. A lot of the programs that have been shown to be effective are structured programs based on social learning principles. So I talked about social learning theory at the beginning of my presentation. Social learning theory can also inform risk management or correctional or violence reduction treatment programs. By, for instance, reinforcing pro-social behavior in prisons, and by reinforcing alternative problem-solving skills, so non-violence problem-solving skills, this may give people the opportunity to practice more pro-social ways of interacting with other people. One of the important things that these programs do is to provide non-violent problem-solving skills. A lot of people who are violent one of the reasons is that they've grown up thinking that that's a way you solve problems. You act violently. If you get into a difficult interpersonal situation, one way to get out of it is to act violently. They may have learned this from observing parents, from observing peers. They may do this because they're impulsive and have a bad temper, but if we can teach them alternative ways to deal with difficult situations, that could reduce their risk. Other types of common approaches include anger management or substance use treatment. We know that these are both important risk factors. And so a number of violence reduction programs and treatment programs include a focus on these risk factors as well. So if we do this, we actually can reduce violence. There's been many, many studies of what are called psychologically informed correctional treatment programs. And on average, it shows that they reduce recidivism by about 20 to 30%. Now you might say, that's okay, it's not that much. But remember, Stats Canada estimates that there are 2 million violent crimes in Canada in a year. If we look down to the US, you can just basically multiply that by 10 or more because they have 10 times the people and they have a higher violent crime rate. We're talking, if you look at this over large numbers of people, this could actually translate into many fewer people being victimized. And I think that's something that we could probably all agree is a good thing. So I think with that, I'm going to end and leave the last 10 minutes or so for questions to any of us on the panel. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
I remind you too, we will just questions to anyone, but please fill out your little report cards for us because we want to run this series again next year. We enjoy having your feedback to help us make this bigger and better event next year, so please do that. And any questions for Kevin or anyone?
Not too long ago, I saw on the TV, they released one of the sex offender, and when they interviewed him, he said he didn't need the treatment, so he refused to take it. And because he served his sentence, they allowed him to release into society, and all the people who were assessing him, they knew he is a very high risk offender. And my question would be is there anything they can do to do research on it, or how to came kind of solution to it not really happening in the future? Because if the original problem, the psychological problem, did not solve, it's most likely going to re-offend, and it's more likely it's going to repeat itself. And it's clearly on his interview, I'm not a psychiatrist, I just studied a few years in it, but it was clearly in his perception, he sees nothing wrong, you know, what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's a great point. You raise another good point as well. When people are released from prison, they may be released under a host of different conditions. They may get early parole, they may be released not until what's called warrant expiry date, which is the very end of the sentence, after which time society actually has no right to require any treatment because they have literally served their sentence. But the other point you raised was essentially a question of treatment motivation and insight into treatment needs. And those are actually both risk factors. And for people who either don't have insight into the fact that they may have a need for treatment, or that they have for either sexually violent or other types of violent tendencies, they're more likely to act violently in the future. And again, there's not much that we can do because, well, treatment can't be forced on people. In a prison, for instance, a person may get out of prison earlier if they go to treatment. And so some exposure to treatment and some potential motivation for why this could help you. For instance, you may live the rest of your life in the community and not have to come back to prison. Could be one way to start motivating people. But if people don't feel they really want to change, it's hard to do something about it. What you do find with a lot of people who are in prison, they don't want to be in prison. And a lot of people will try to do something so that they can live in the community without coming back to prison.
It's my understanding that individuals who score highly on the PCLR don't really benefit from treatment. So what do you think we should do with these people then?
Well, that's probably one of the hardest questions there is. So thanks for asking it. I'm just teasing. That's a really good question. And it's actually, we don't know if people who are highly psychopathic are not treatable. We just simply don't know that because there's not been good, there's not been good research into that question. There's been a couple of really recent studies that have shown with increased doses of treatment, so with more frequent treatment, we actually may see the similar responses in people who are highly psychopathic in terms of a reduction in crime and violence. So it's certainly, it would not make sense at all to stop trying. And it would not make sense at all to take a kind of punitive, lock people up forever based on their personality approach. So I think that with kind of further research into potentially effective ways of treating people based on what we know is effective more generally, we may be able to see some crime reduction in people who are highly psychopathic as well. There's a couple of approaches that we probably shouldn't take with people who are highly psychopathic. There's a type of violence reduction program called empathy training. And for people who may lack the capacity to feel empathy, it would probably not be a good expenditure of resources. So the approaches have to take other sorts of shapes, like nonviolent problem solving and so forth.